The gunshot echoed through Red Creek's dusty main street like thunder on a clear morning, shattering the relative peace that Sheriff Thomas McKenna had worked 6 months to establish. McKenna dropped his morning coffee, the tin cup clattering against the wooden porch of his office as he watched a man stumble backward from the saloon doors, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers like crimson ink spreading through parchment. The wounded man was Jake Morrison, one of the town's more troublesome drifters, but what caught McKenna's attention wasn't the familiar sight of another barroom dispute. It was the figure that emerged from the saloon's batwing doors, moving with deliberate grace that seemed entirely out of place in this rough mining town carved into the Arizona Territory's unforgiving landscape. She was dressed entirely in black, from the elegant morning dress that swept the dusty ground to the delicate lace veil that partially obscured her face. Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had arrived on the morning stage 3 days prior, claiming to be the widow of a deceased miner, stood in the doorway holding a small derringer with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. McKenna approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, the way he'd learned to move when tensions ran high and one wrong gesture could turn a recoverable situation into a tragedy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, and the usual sounds of the town seemed to have been swallowed by an unnatural silence. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts stood unusually still, as if sensing the electric tension that had settled over Red Creek like a suffocating blanket. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sheriff McKenna said, his voice carrying the measured tone he'd perfected during his years of trying to talk his way out of violence rather than shooting his way through it. "I believe there might be some misunderstanding here that we can resolve without anyone else getting hurt." The woman's eyes, visible through the delicate mesh of her veil, fixed on McKenna with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of how exposed he stood in the middle of the street. Those eyes held something he'd seen before in the faces of people who had been pushed too far, a cold determination that spoke of decisions already made and consequences already accepted. "There's no misunderstanding, Sheriff," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had received an education far from the rough frontier towns where such luxuries were rare as spring rain. "Mr. Morrison thought he could put his hands where they weren't invited. I simply corrected his assumption." Jake Morrison, still clutching his wounded shoulder, looked between the sheriff and the woman with the confused expression of a man who had expected one thing and received something entirely different. His face was pale, whether from blood loss or shock, McKenna couldn't tell, but the drifter seemed to have lost all interest in continuing whatever confrontation had begun inside the saloon. "Ma'am," McKenna continued, taking another careful step closer, "I appreciate that you were defending yourself, but in Red Creek, we try to handle these matters through the proper channels. Perhaps you could lower that weapon and we could discuss this situation like civilized people." Eleanor Blackwood tilted her head slightly, studying McKenna with the same clinical attention a naturalist might give to an interesting specimen. The derringer remained steady in her grip, and McKenna noticed that her hand showed no tremor whatsoever. This was not the nervous reaction of someone unused to violence, but the controlled response of someone who had held weapons before and knew their weight and balance. "Civilized," she repeated, and there was something in the way she spoke the word that suggested she found it amusing. "Tell me, Sheriff, what exactly passes for civilization in Red Creek? Is it civilized when miners work 16-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely keep them fed? Is it civilized when the town's leading citizens hold secret meetings to decide which claims get flooded and which miners get run out of town? Or perhaps it's civilized when men like Mr. Morrison think they can take whatever they want from women who appear to be alone and defenseless." McKenna felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in her words that suggested she knew far more about Red Creek's business than any newcomer should. The woman had been in town for only 3 days, claiming to be settling her late husband's mining affairs, but she spoke with the familiarity of someone who had been watching and listening for much longer than that. The sheriff glanced around and noticed that a small crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the street, drawn by the gunshot but maintaining a respectful distance from the woman in black. Among the faces, he recognized several of the town's more prominent citizens. There was Marcus Holloway, who owned the largest mine in the area, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. Judge William Carver stood near the bank, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking as he watched the confrontation unfold. Most interesting of all was the reaction of Henry Whitmore, the town's banker and unofficial leader of Red Creek's business community. Whitmore had emerged from his establishment across the street but had stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Eleanor Blackwood. The color had drained from his face so completely that McKenna wondered if the man might actually faint. "Mrs. Blackwood," McKenna said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone as he began to sense undercurrents in the situation that he didn't fully understand, "I think it might be best if we continued this conversation in private. Perhaps you'd be willing to accompany me to my office where we could discuss your concerns about the town's business practices in more detail." Eleanor Blackwood's lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it held no warmth whatsoever. "My concerns, Sheriff? I'm simply a grieving widow trying to settle her late husband's affairs. What possible concerns could I have about Red Creek's business practices?" But as she spoke, her gaze moved slowly across the faces of the men watching from the edges of the street, lingering on Holloway, Carver, and Whitmore with particular attention. Each man seemed to shrink slightly under her scrutiny, and McKenna began to understand that whatever was happening here went far deeper than a simple case of self-defense in a saloon. The derringer remained steady in her hand, and McKenna realized that Jake Morrison's wounded shoulder might be the least of his problems. There was something about Eleanor Blackwood that didn't fit with her story of being a simple widow, something in the way she moved and spoke that suggested a familiarity with danger and violence that went beyond a single moment of self-defense. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and filling the air with the promise of another scorching day in the Arizona Territory. But McKenna found himself thinking that the heat building in Red Creek had very little to do with the weather, and everything to do with the mysterious woman in black who seemed to know far more about his town's secrets than any stranger should. As if reading his thoughts, Eleanor Blackwood finally lowered the derringer, tucking it somewhere within the folds of her morning dress with a practiced motion that confirmed McKenna's growing suspicions about her familiarity with weapons. But her eyes never left his face, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of a promise that made the sheriff's blood run cold. "You're quite right, Sheriff McKenna. We should definitely continue this conversation. There's so much about Red Creek's history that I'm eager to discuss. So many old debts that need to be settled, so many questions that deserve answers. I do hope the town's leading citizens will be available to participate in these discussions. After all, they've been such integral parts of Red Creek's story for so many years." With that, she turned and walked back into the saloon, her black dress swishing against the dusty ground, leaving McKenna standing in the middle of the street with more questions than answers and the growing certainty that the peace he had worked so hard to establish in Red Creek was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Sheriff McKenna spent the rest of the morning asking questions that nobody seemed willing to answer. The more he pressed the townspeople about Eleanor Blackwood and her mysterious late husband, the more evasive their responses became. Old Martha at the general store suddenly developed a convenient case of poor memory when asked about mining records. The clerk at the assayer's office claimed that several ledger books from 5 years past had been damaged in a water leak that McKenna had never heard mentioned before. Even Doc Harrison, usually the most straightforward man in Red Creek, became unusually interested in organizing his medical supplies whenever the conversation turned to deceased miners. By midday, McKenna found himself standing in the cramped records office above the bank, watching Henry Whitmore nervously shuffle through filing cabinets with hands that trembled so badly he could barely grip the folders. The banker's usual confident demeanor had crumbled completely since the morning's incident, replaced by the jittery behavior of a man who knew he was being hunted but couldn't see his predator in the tall grass. "Henry," McKenna said, settling his considerable frame into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, "I've known you for 6 months now, and I've never seen you this rattled. What exactly is it about Mrs. Blackwood that has you jumping at every shadow?" Whitmore's laugh came out as more of a strangled sound, somewhere between humor and hysteria. "Nothing at all, Sheriff. Just concerned about maintaining proper records, you understand. Can't be too careful with documentation when it comes to mining claims and inheritance matters. Wouldn't want any legal complications arising from incomplete paperwork." But McKenna had spent enough years reading people's faces to know when someone was lying, and Whitmore's expression practically screamed deception. The banker's eyes darted constantly toward the window that overlooked the main street, as if he expected to see Eleanor Blackwood materializing from the desert dust like some vengeful spirit summoned by guilt and bad decisions. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when trying to coax information from reluctant witnesses. "Henry, I need you to understand something. that woman shot a man in broad daylight on my main street. Now, Jake Morrison probably had it coming, and I'm inclined to believe her version of events, but she's clearly not the simple grieving widow she claims to be. She knows things about this town that she shouldn't know, and from what I observed this morning, you and several other prominent citizens are scared half to death of her." Whitmore's hand stilled on the filing cabinet, and for a moment the only sound in the small office was the ticking of the ornate clock on the wall, a timepiece far too expensive for a frontier town but perfectly in keeping with Whitmore's taste for displays of wealth and status. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left buried, Sheriff. Red Creek has prospered under certain arrangements, and sometimes prosperity requires difficult decisions. Not everyone who comes to mining country is suited for the life, and not everyone who makes claims knows how to work them properly. The territory is harsh, and it takes strong men to build something lasting from the dust and rock." McKenna felt his patience wearing thin like an old saddle subjected to too many hard rides. "That's a fine speech about frontier pragmatism, Henry, but it doesn't explain why you look like you've seen a ghost every time Mrs. Blackwood's name comes up. What difficult decisions are we talking about here?" Before Whitmore could answer, the sound of voices from the street below drew both men to the window. Eleanor Blackwood had emerged from the hotel and was walking slowly down the main street, her black dress creating a stark contrast against the sun-bleached buildings and dusty ground. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a man McKenna didn't recognize, tall and lean with the weathered look of someone who had spent years working under the open sky. "Who's that with her?" McKenna asked, but Whitmore had gone completely white, gripping the windowsill with such force that his knuckles stood out like bare bone. "Christ Almighty," Whitmore whispered, his voice filled with a terror so profound that McKenna felt his own pulse quicken in response. "That's Tom Dalton." "But Tom Dalton is dead. We buried him 5 years ago in the cemetery outside town." McKenna squinted at the figure walking beside Eleanor Blackwood, trying to make out details from their second-story vantage point. The man moved with the slightly uneven gait of someone favoring an old injury, and there was something familiar about his profile that nagged at the sheriff's memory like a half-remembered song. "Henry," McKenna said carefully, his lawman's instincts telling him that he was finally approaching the heart of whatever secret had been eating away at Red Creek's foundation, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened to Tom Dalton 5 years ago. And I need you to tell me the truth this time." Whitmore slumped into his desk chair as if his legs could no longer support his weight. The confident banker who had welcomed McKenna to Red Creek 6 months ago had disappeared completely, replaced by a broken man who looked as if he had aged a decade in the space of a single morning. "Tom Dalton came to Red Creek in 1882 with his sister Emma," Whitmore began, his voice hollow and distant. "They filed claims on some promising land up in the hills, land that showed good color and had water access. Tom was a hard worker, knew his business, and he was making good progress on his dig. But the land he claimed was part of a larger area that certain parties had been planning to consolidate for a major operation." McKenna felt pieces of a dark puzzle beginning to fall into place, creating a picture that made his stomach turn with the implications. "Certain parties meaning you and your associates, I assume?" Whitmore nodded miserably. Marcus Holloway had surveyed the entire area and determined that the individual claims could be worked much more efficiently as a single large-scale operation. There were technical advantages to consolidating the digging, better access to equipment and supplies, more efficient ore processing. It would have been better for everyone involved, including Tom and Emma Dalton. "But they refused to sell," McKenna said, and it wasn't really a question. Tom was stubborn, always talking about independence and making his own way. He didn't understand the bigger picture, didn't see how his small operation was holding back progress for the entire area. We tried to reason with him, offered him fair compensation for his claim, even offered him a position with the consolidated operation. But he wouldn't listen. McKenna's hands clenched into fists as he began to understand the true nature of the difficult decisions Whitmore had mentioned. "And so you decided to help him see reason?" Whitmore flinched as if McKenna had struck him. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. Judge Carver had found some irregularities in Tom's filing paperwork, technical violations that would have allowed the claim to be reassigned. We thought we could pressure him into accepting our offer, maybe make things a bit uncomfortable for him until he came around to our way of thinking. The sheriff's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke again. "What kind of uncomfortable, Henry?" The banker's face crumpled as if he were about to cry. "There was an accident at his dig. Some of the support timbers failed, and Tom was caught in a cave-in. By the time we got him out, he was hurt bad, real bad. Doc Harrison said he might not make it, and even if he did, he'd probably never be able to work a claim again." McKenna felt rage building in his chest like a fire fed with dry kindling. "An accident." Whitmore's voice broke completely. Tom knew it wasn't an accident. Even lying there broken and bleeding, he knew we had sabotaged his supports. He looked right at me and said that Emma would come back for us someday, that she'd make sure we paid for what we'd done. Then he died 3 days later from his injuries, and Emma disappeared the same night. We figured she'd gone back east, maybe to family. We never expected to see her again. The truth hit McKenna like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him staring down at the street where Eleanor Blackwood walked beside the ghost of her murdered brother. Because that's what it was, he realized. Murder. Deliberate and calculated murder dressed up as a mining accident and justified by greed and the cruel mathematics of frontier capitalism. "She's not Eleanor Blackwood at all," McKenna said, his voice barely audible even in the quiet office. "No," Whitmore whispered. "She's Emma Dalton, and she's come back to Red Creek to keep her brother's promise." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma Dalton looked up at the window where they stood watching. Even from a distance, McKenna could see her eyes clearly, and the cold determination he had glimpsed that morning had intensified into something far more dangerous. She raised her hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a salute, and then she smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. McKenna's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what he had learned. Emma Dalton had spent 5 years planning her return to Red Creek, 5 years preparing for a reckoning with the men who had murdered her brother. The mysterious companion walking beside her might be Tom Dalton's ghost or might be something else entirely, but either way, she had not come back alone or unprepared. The sheriff thought about his commitment to bringing peace to Red Creek, about his belief that violence could always be avoided through reasonable conversation and proper legal channels. He thought about the corrupt network of businessmen who had built their prosperity on murder and called it progress. He thought about Emma Dalton walking through his town with death in her eyes and justice in her heart. And for the first time since arriving in Red Creek, Sheriff Thomas McKenna began to wonder if some problems were too deep and too rotten to be solved with words alone. As he watched Emma Dalton disappear into the afternoon shadows between the buildings, he realized that the peace he had worked so hard to establish was about to be tested in ways that would require him to choose between the law he had sworn to uphold and the justice that had been denied for far too long. The sound of gunshots echoing from the direction of the saloon told him that his time for making that choice had just run out.